Hi, my name is Lucian Orevall. When my father died suddenly of a heart attack, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. I was just the quiet stepson who helped run his logistics company in Millbrook Heights, never asking for recognition, never demanding a seat at the executive table. My stepmother Dahlia made it clear I was nothing more than a burden she'd inherited, along with Dad's business empire. The night after the funeral, she had security escort me out of the corporate headquarters, telling me I had no claim to anything my father built. She thought I was just another employee she could discard. She thought I'd disappear quietly into the background like I always had. But what Dahlia didn't know was that my father had been planning for this moment for years. Hidden in his private safe was a document that would shatter her carefully constructed world and reveal the truth about who really owned Orevall Industries. Want to know what my father left behind that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't cry at the funeral. I stood there in my ill-fitting black suit, watching my father's casket being lowered into the ground at Thornwick Cemetery, surrounded by hundreds of people who knew him as the CEO of Orevall Industries, but I felt completely alone. My stepmother Dahlia stood beside me in her designer mourning dress, playing the grieving widow perfectly for the cameras, but I could feel the calculation behind her tears. I'm Lucian Orevall, 28 years old, operations coordinator at my father's logistics empire. I've never been the face of the company, never demanded the spotlight, never caused drama or made waves. For 8 years I worked quietly in the background, managing supply chains and coordinating with drivers across our network of distribution centers. I was the one who stayed late to solve problems, who came in on weekends when emergencies arose, who knew every route and every driver by name. But I was also just the stepson, the quiet one who fixed things without fanfare. My father, Edmund Orevall, built Orevall Industries from a single truck and a dream 40 years ago. By the time he died, we were the largest independent logistics company in the Pacific Northwest, with annual revenues approaching $200 million. Our trucks carried everything from tech components to agricultural products across 12 states, and our warehouse facilities in Millbrook Heights employed over 3,000 people. I'd always assumed that when Dad passed, Dahlia would inherit the controlling interest in the company. She'd been married to him for 15 years, had managed the corporate social events, had sat in on board meetings as an observer. She understood the business side of things, had an MBA from Northwestern, and knew how to talk to investors and banking partners. I was just the guy who made sure the trucks ran on time. But standing there at the graveside, watching dirt fall onto my father's casket, I had no idea that everything I thought I knew about my place in this family was about to change. I had no idea about the conversations my father had been having with his attorney over the past 2 years. I had no idea about the documents he'd been signing in private, or the provisions he'd made to protect the company he'd spent his life building. Most importantly, I had no idea that Dahlia had been planning for this day far longer than any of us realized. The reception after the funeral was held at the Millbrook Heights Country Club, the same venue where Dad and Dahlia had celebrated their wedding anniversary every year. The gathering was a mix of family, business associates, competitors, and employees. I moved through the crowd accepting condolences, shaking hands and listening to story after story about my father's generosity, his business acumen, his commitment to treating employees fairly. Thomas Grimley, our head of logistics, pulled me aside near the bar. "Your father was proud of you, Lucian," he said quietly. "He used to tell me you had a better understanding of the operational side than anyone else in the company. Said you could run this place with your eyes closed." I nodded politely, not knowing how to respond. Dad had never said anything like that to me directly. Our relationship had always been professional, respectful, but distant. He was a man of few words who expressed love through action rather than sentiment. Dahlia appeared at my elbow, her hand settling on my arm with practiced grace. "Thomas, thank you so much for being here today," she said, her voice perfectly modulated for public consumption. "Edmund valued your friendship so much." She turned to me with that smile I'd grown to recognize over the years, the one that looked warm but never reached her eyes. "Lucian, sweetheart, I need to speak with you privately when you have a moment." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten, but I simply nodded. Of course. The conversation came later that evening, after the last guests had left the country club and we'd returned to the family estate in Thornwick Hills. The house felt enormous and empty without Dad's presence. His reading glasses still sat on the side table next to his favorite chair. His coffee mug was still in the sink from the morning he'd suffered his heart attack. Dahlia had changed out of her funeral dress into a cream-colored pantsuit that made her look more like the businesswoman she'd become than the grieving widow she'd played all day. She poured herself a glass of wine and gestured for me to sit across from her in the living room. "I know this is difficult timing," she began, "but we need to discuss the future of the company. With Edmund gone, there are going to be some significant changes." I waited, sensing there was more coming. "The board met yesterday evening for an emergency session," she continued. "Given the circumstances, they've asked me to step into the role of interim CEO while we navigate the transition period. It's what Edmund would have wanted." This surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have. Dahlia had been increasingly involved in company operations over the past few years, attending more meetings, weighing in on strategic decisions. She'd earned an MBA specifically to better understand the business side of Dad's work. "That makes sense," I said carefully. "You understand the financial side better than anyone." Her smile became more genuine, as if I'd passed some kind of test. "I'm glad you see it that way. Now, about your role going forward." She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. "I think it might be best if you took some time away from the company. To grieve, to figure out what you want to do with your life. You're still young, Lucian. You have options." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. "You're asking me to leave Orevall Industries." "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time for you to find your own path," she said gently. "You've been working in Edmund's shadow for years. Don't you want to see what you're capable of on your own?" I studied her face, looking for any sign of the woman who'd been part of our family for 15 years, who'd celebrated my graduation from college, who'd asked me to help her surprise Dad with a vintage truck for his 60th birthday. But the person sitting across from me was someone else entirely, someone calculating and cold. "And if I don't want to leave?" Her smile faltered slightly. "Well, that would make things complicated. The board is concerned about having too many family members in operational roles. It creates potential conflicts of interest, especially during a leadership transition." I realized then that this wasn't a conversation, it was a notification. She'd already made the decision, probably before Dad's body was even cold. The board meeting, the interim CEO appointment, my suggested departure, it had all been orchestrated. "I see," I said quietly. "When do you want me gone?" "Take the weekend to collect your personal items from the office. I'll have HR prepare a generous severance package. You've been a valuable employee, Lucian, and we want to make sure you're taken care of." Employee. Not family member, not stepson, not someone who dedicated 8 years of his life to building the company his father had started. Just an employee being let go. I stood up slowly, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. "I'll clear out my office on Monday." "I think that's for the best," Dahlia said, and for the first time since the funeral, her smile looked completely genuine. That night, I lay awake in my apartment in downtown Millbrook Heights, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 48 hours, I'd lost my father and my career. The company that had been my second home for nearly a decade was now off-limits to me, controlled by a woman who'd just made it clear that I was an unwanted complication in her plans. But as I thought about the conversation, something nagged at me. Dad had always been meticulous about business planning. He'd spent decades building Orevall Industries into something that could survive economic downturns, industry changes, and competitive pressures. Would he really have left the company's future entirely in the hands of someone who could make such dramatic personnel decisions without consulting the broader leadership team? I remembered something Thomas Grimley had said at the reception about Dad being proud of my operational knowledge. I thought about all the late nights Dad and I had spent going over route optimization reports, discussing driver retention strategies, analyzing competitor movements. Those weren't the conversations of a man preparing to cut his son out of the business. Something didn't add up, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt a spark of something other than grief. I felt suspicious. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, Dahlia's confidence in her position was premature. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As dawn broke over Millbrook Heights, I made a decision. I would clear out my office as requested, but I would also start asking questions. Questions about Dad's will, about the board meeting Dahlia claimed had happened, about the legal structure of Orevall Industries that I'd never bothered to investigate before. I had a feeling that my stepmother's victory celebration might be premature. And if I was right, she was about to discover that the quiet stepson she'd just dismissed wasn't quite as powerless as she'd assumed. Growing up, I never expected to work for my father's company. Edmund Orevall was a force of nature, a man who'd built an empire from nothing, and I was just a quiet teenager who preferred books to boardrooms. When my mother died in a car accident when I was 16, Dad and I barely knew how to talk to each other without her serving as the bridge between us. That changed when he married Dahlia 3 years later. She brought warmth back into our house, organized family dinners, encouraged Dad to take vacations, and somehow managed to get both of us talking again. For the first few years of their marriage, I genuinely thought of her as the mother I'd lost. She attended my high school graduation, helped me move into my college dorm, and even drove 8 hours to attend my graduation ceremony when Dad got stuck dealing with a labor dispute. I studied supply chain management at Portland State, partly because I was genuinely interested in logistics and partly because I thought it might give Dad and me something to bond over. When I graduated, he offered me an entry-level position at Orevall Industries, not as his son, but as a regular employee who would have to prove himself like everyone else. "I won't give you anything you don't earn," he told me on my first day, "but I won't hold you back if you're willing to work for it." That was 8 years ago. I started in the warehouse, learning how to operate forklifts and coordinate loading schedules. I spent 6 months on the road with veteran drivers, understanding every route in our network. I worked night shifts in dispatch, handling emergencies and route changes. Slowly, methodically, I learned every aspect of the business from the ground up. Dad never showed favoritism, never promoted me ahead of more qualified candidates, never gave me special treatment. If anything, he was harder on me than on other employees, demanding perfection and holding me to standards that sometimes felt impossible to meet. But gradually, I earned the respect of the other employees, not because of my last name, but because I was willing to do any job I asked them to do. My relationship with Dahlia remained strong throughout those early years. She'd ask about my work over family dinners, offer advice about office politics, and even helped me navigate a difficult situation with a supervisor who resented having the boss's son on his team. When I got promoted to operations coordinator, she was the first person to congratulate me. "Your father is proud of you," she told me that night. "He doesn't say it often, but I can see it in his eyes when he talks about your work." I treasured those conversations because Dad himself rarely offered direct praise. He was a man of few words who expressed approval through increased responsibility rather than verbal affirmation. When he started including me in strategic planning meetings, I knew I'd earned his trust. When he asked for my input on potential acquisitions, I understood that he saw me as more than just an employee. But looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. Dahlia's questions about my work became more detailed over time, more focused on specific operational procedures and financial structures. Her interest in the company's strategic direction intensified, and she began attending board meetings as an observer, claiming she wanted to better understand the business that consumed so much of her husband's time. I thought she was being supportive. I thought she was trying to become more involved in Dad's professional life so they could share that part of their relationship. I never suspected that she was conducting reconnaissance, gathering information about every aspect of Orevall Industries so she could eventually take control of it. The signs were all there if I'd been paying attention. The way she steered conversations towards succession planning when Dad wasn't in the room. The casual questions about which employees were most loyal to the family versus most loyal to the company. The subtle suggestions that Dad should consider bringing in outside management consultants to professionalize the operation. 3 months before Dad died, Dahlia suggested that I should consider pursuing an MBA. "You have all this operational experience," she said, "but if you really want to advance in the company, you need to understand the financial side better." It seemed like reasonable advice from someone who cared about my career development. Now I realized she was trying to get me out of the company for 2 years while she consolidated her position. An MBA program would have required me to step back from day-to-day operations, creating space for her to insert herself more deeply into the management structure. I declined, saying I preferred learning through experience rather than classroom study. Dad supported my decision, which seemed to frustrate Dahlia, though she hid it well. "Some people are natural learners," Dad said at dinner that night. "Lucian understands this business better than most people with graduate degrees. He's earned his position through merit, not credentials." It was rare for Dad to offer such direct praise, and I cherished the moment. Dahlia smiled and agreed, but something in her expression seemed forced. I attributed it to disappointment that I wasn't pursuing additional education, not realizing that my continued presence in the company was becoming an obstacle to her plans. The last real conversation I had with my father happened 2 weeks before his heart attack. We were working late in his office, reviewing quarterly performance reports, when he suddenly stopped looking at the spreadsheets and turned to me. "You know this company better than anyone else," he said quietly. "You understand the culture, the operations, the people. That's not something you can learn in business school or pick up from consulting reports." I didn't know how to respond to such direct acknowledgement, so I just nodded. "I've been thinking about the future," he continued, "about what happens to Orevall Industries when I'm not here anymore. This company is more than just a business. It's a responsibility to the people who work here, to the communities we serve, to the legacy we're trying to build." He paused, staring out the window at the warehouse complex below us. Trucks were loading for overnight deliveries, their headlights cutting through the darkness as drivers prepared for long hauls across the Pacific Northwest. "Someday this will all be your responsibility," he said. "I hope you're ready for that." At the time, I thought he was speaking hypothetically about some distant future when he would retire. I didn't realize he was trying to prepare me for a transition that would come much sooner than either of us expected. I didn't understand that he was trying to tell me something important about the provisions he'd made for the company's future. 2 weeks later, he collapsed in his office from a massive heart attack. The paramedics said he died almost instantly, probably feeling no pain. The doctor said there had been no warning signs, no symptoms that might have predicted such a sudden cardiac event. But as I stood in that same office the day after the funeral, packing up my personal belongings while Dahlia watched from the doorway, I remembered that conversation. I remembered the weight in his voice when he talked about responsibility and legacy. I remembered how he'd emphasized my understanding of the company's culture and operations. Those weren't the words of a man planning to leave his life's work entirely in the hands of someone who'd never driven a truck, never worked a night shift in dispatch, never earned the trust of the warehouse crews through years of shared labor. Edmund Orevall had been many things: demanding, reserved, sometimes difficult to read, but he wasn't careless. He didn't build a $200 million company by making impulsive decisions or failing to plan for contingencies. The man who'd spent 40 years thinking 3 moves ahead in business wouldn't have left the company's future to chance. As I carried the last box of my belongings to my car, I realized that maybe my father had been planning for this transition longer than any of us knew. Maybe the conversation about responsibility and legacy hadn't been hypothetical at all. Maybe he'd been trying to prepare me for something that Dahlia either didn't know about or was deliberately hiding from me. Standing in the parking lot of Orevall Industries, looking up at the building that had been my second home for 8 years, I made a decision. I wasn't going to disappear quietly like Dahlia expected. I was going to find out what my father had really planned for the company's future. And if Dahlia had been lying about the board meeting, about the succession plan, about my role in the company going forward, she was about to discover that the quiet stepson she'd just dismissed knew a lot more about fighting than she'd assumed. Before everything changed, Orevall Industries felt like home in a way that our actual house never quite did. The corporate headquarters sat on a sprawling complex in the Millbrook Heights industrial district, a collection of modern office buildings connected to massive warehouse facilities where our fleet of trucks loaded and unloaded around the clock. I knew every inch of that operation. I could walk through the main warehouse blindfolded, navigating between towering shelves of inventory and the constant ballet of forklifts moving goods from receiving to shipping. I knew which drivers preferred early morning routes and which ones worked better on overnight hauls. I understood the rhythm of the business, the seasonal fluctuations, the delicate balance between operational efficiency and customer satisfaction. My office was on the 3rd floor of the main building, with a window that overlooked the dispatch center where our route coordinators managed the daily movement of hundreds of trucks across 12 states. It wasn't a corner office, didn't have a view of the mountains, but it was positioned perfectly to keep me connected to the operational heartbeat of the company. Dad's office was 2 floors above mine, a spacious corner suite with conference tables, leather furniture, and walls lined with awards from industry associations and photographs documenting the company's growth over 4 decades. I'd been in that office countless times for meetings, strategy sessions, and the occasional father-son conversation that felt more like a performance review than family bonding. Dahlia's presence in the company had evolved gradually over the years. Initially, she'd simply attended the annual Christmas party and the summer company picnic, playing the supportive wife role with grace and charm. But as her marriage to Dad deepened, she began taking more interest in the business side of his life. She started by volunteering to organize corporate events, handling logistics for the annual shareholder meeting, and coordinating vendor relationships for the executive dining room. Her MBA background made her valuable for financial analysis projects, and Dad increasingly relied on her input for strategic planning initiatives. The shift became more pronounced about 3 years ago when Dad had a minor health scare. Nothing serious, just exhaustion from working too many hours, and his doctor recommended reducing his stress load. Dahlia stepped in to handle more of the administrative burden, reviewing contracts, attending board meetings as an observer, and serving as a liaison between Dad and various department heads. To everyone else in the company, it looked like natural evolution. The CEO's wife was helping him manage his workload while he focused on the big-picture strategic decisions. Employees liked Dahlia. She remembered their names, asked about their families, and advocated for better benefits packages and workplace improvements. But there were moments when I caught glimpses of something else beneath her polished exterior. Like the time she questioned why we gave Christmas bonuses to drivers who'd been with the company for less than 5 years, suggesting that loyalty rewards should be reserved for longer-term employees. Or when she recommended restructuring our pension plan to reduce long-term liabilities, even though Dad had always believed that taking care of employees after retirement was a moral obligation. Il ad war. These weren't necessarily wrong suggestions from a business perspective, but they felt inconsistent with the company culture Dad had built over 40 years. Orevall Industries had always operated more like a family business than a corporate entity, prioritizing employee welfare and community relationships over pure profit maximization. I mentioned my concerns to Dad during one of our quarterly review meetings, choosing my words carefully to avoid criticizing Dahlia directly. "She's trying to help," Dad said, not looking up from the spreadsheet we were reviewing. "Some of her suggestions make sense from a financial standpoint." "I'm not questioning her business acumen," I replied. "I'm just wondering if we want to change the fundamental character of how we operate." Dad finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "The character of this company isn't determined by our benefits package, Lucian. It's determined by how we treat people when nobody's watching, how we respond when things go wrong, whether we keep our word even when it costs us money." He was right, of course, but I still felt uneasy about the direction of some recent policy changes. We'd started requiring more documentation for expense reports, implemented new performance evaluation metrics that emphasized individual productivity over team collaboration, and begun outsourcing some functions that had previously been handled by long-term employees. None of these changes were dramatic by themselves, but collectively they represented a shift toward a more corporate, less personal approach to business operations. Employees noticed the difference, though most were reluctant to complain directly to management. Thomas Grimley, our head of logistics, mentioned it during one of our weekly operational reviews. "The drivers are asking questions," he said. "Nothing specific, just a feeling that things are changing around here." "What kind of questions?" "Whether their jobs are secure, whether the company is planning to sell out to one of the big national carriers, whether management still cares about the people who've been here for decades." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "They trust you, Lucian, and they trust your father. But some of the recent changes have them worried." I promised to bring their concerns to Dad's attention, but when I tried to raise the issue, he seemed distracted and dismissed their worries as resistance to necessary modernization. "We can't run a $200 million company the same way we ran a $20 million company," he said. "Some of these changes are overdue." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was too attached to the old ways of doing things, too sentimental about maintaining traditions that didn't serve the company's long-term interests. But the unease persisted, particularly when I noticed how Dahlia's role in strategic decision-making continued to expand. She began attending senior management meetings, offering input on everything from technology upgrades to personnel decisions. She advocated for hiring outside consultants to conduct efficiency audits, suggested bringing in executive search firms to evaluate our leadership pipeline, and recommended restructuring some departments to eliminate redundancies. Again, none of these suggestions were unreasonable by themselves, but they all pointed in the same direction, toward a more corporate, less family-oriented approach to running Orevall Industries. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 6 months before Dad's death, when Dahlia suggested that the company might benefit from professional board governance rather than the informal advisory structure Dad had maintained for decades. "You need independent directors," she argued during a family dinner. "People with experience in logistics, finance, technology, experts who can provide objective oversight and strategic guidance." Dad seemed receptive to the idea, acknowledging that the company had grown beyond the size where informal governance structures made sense. Within 3 months, we'd assembled a 5-person board of directors, including 2 outside experts in transportation logistics, a former CFO from a major regional corporation, and a retired federal judge with experience in business law. Dahlia was appointed to the board as well, representing the family's interests in company governance. Her appointment made sense given her MBA background and her increasing involvement in company operations. What I didn't realize at the time was that this board restructuring had given Dahlia a formal platform for influencing company decisions and a group of outside directors who knew her primarily as the CEO's capable wife rather than understanding the full history and culture of Orevall Industries. Yoshes. Looking back, I can see how carefully she'd positioned herself over the course of several years. She'd gradually assumed more responsibility, built relationships with key employees and outside advisors, and established herself as an indispensable part of the company's leadership structure. By the time Dad suffered his heart attack, Dahlia wasn't just the grieving widow of the company founder. She was a board member with an MBA, a respected voice in strategic planning, and someone who understood the financial and operational details of the business well enough to speak credibly about its future direction. I, on the other hand, was just the operations coordinator. I knew the business intimately from an operational standpoint, had earned the respect of employees through years of shared work, and understood the company culture better than anyone else, but I had no formal authority, no board position, and no obvious claim to leadership succession. It was the perfect setup for what happened next. When Dad died suddenly, Dahlia was positioned to step seamlessly into a leadership role, while I was positioned to be marginalized as someone whose operational knowledge was valuable, but whose authority was dispensable. The only question was whether Dad had anticipated this possibility and made provisions to protect the company's future in ways that Dahlia either didn't know about or was choosing to ignore. I was about to find out. The call came at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I was in the warehouse reviewing a shipment manifest when my phone buzzed with Dahlia's number. Her voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand her words. "Lucian, you need to get to Memorial Hospital right now. It's your father. He collapsed in his office. The paramedics are working on him, but you need to come immediately." The 20-minute drive to the hospital felt like hours. I kept thinking about our conversation from the night before, a routine discussion about a potential contract extension with one of our major clients. Dad had seemed tired, but not unwell, focused but not stressed beyond his normal level. There had been no warning signs, no complaints about chest pain or breathing problems. When I arrived at the emergency room, Dahlia was pacing in the waiting area, her designer suit wrinkled and her usually perfect makeup smeared from crying. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, fragile in a way that reminded me of the woman who'd comforted me after my mother's death. "The doctors are still working on him," she said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "They won't tell me anything except that it was a massive heart attack. He was in a meeting with the logistics team when it happened. Thomas found him on the floor." We waited for 3 hours before Dr. Patricia Hawkins emerged from the emergency room with the expression medical professionals wear when they're about to deliver news no one wants to hear. "I'm very sorry," she said gently. "We did everything we could, but the damage to his heart was too extensive. He passed away about 20 minutes ago." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I heard Dahlia's sharp intake of breath, felt her hand slip from mine, but couldn't quite process what the doctor was telling us. Edmund Orevall, the man who'd built an empire from a single truck, who'd worked 16-hour days well into his 60s, who'd never missed a day of work due to illness in 40 years, was gone. "Was there any suffering?" Dahlia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Dr. Hawkins replied. "From what the paramedics told me, he lost consciousness almost immediately. He wouldn't have felt any pain." The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and decisions that needed to be made. Dahlia handled most of the administrative details while I sat in the hospital parking lot, calling employees and business partners to inform them of Dad's death. Thomas grimly wept openly when I told him the news. Several of our longtime drivers asked if they could serve as pallbearers. That evening, back at the family estate, Dahlia and I sat in Dad's study trying to compile a list of people who needed to be notified personally before the news became public. The room still smelled like his cologne and the leather cleaner he used on his desk chair. His reading glasses sat folded next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. "He was proud of you," Dahlia said suddenly, breaking a long silence. "He may not have said it often, but he talked about your work constantly. How you understood the business, how the employees respected you, how you'd earned everything you'd achieved." It was exactly what I needed to hear, and I was grateful that she'd thought to share it. We spent the rest of the evening making arrangements for the funeral, agreeing on the service location, selecting music, and coordinating with the funeral director about logistics. For those first 48 hours after Dad's death, Dahlia and I functioned as a team united by shared grief and the overwhelming responsibilities of organizing a funeral for someone who'd been a prominent figure in the local business community. I had no reason to suspect that her expressions of support were anything other than genuine. The funeral service was held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in downtown Millbrook Heights, the same church where Dad and Dahlia had been married 15 years earlier. The sanctuary was packed with employees, competitors, suppliers, city officials, and family friends representing 4 decades of relationships Dad had built throughout his career. Dahlia delivered a beautiful eulogy about Dad's integrity, his commitment to treating employees fairly, and his belief that business success should serve the broader community. I spoke briefly about his mentorship and the example he'd set for leading with both strength and compassion. Thomas grimly represented the employees with remarks about Dad's accessibility and his genuine interest in the welfare of every person who worked for Orevall Industries. The reception afterward felt like a celebration of Dad's life rather than just a gathering of mourners. Stories were shared about his generosity during economic downturns, his support for employee education programs, and his quiet philanthropic efforts that many people hadn't known about during his lifetime. Several board members approached me to express their condolences and their appreciation for my work over the years. Margaret Chen, the retired federal judge who joined our board 6 months earlier, made a point of telling me that Dad had spoken highly of my operational expertise and leadership potential. "He was very proud of the man you'd become," she said. "Your father believed that the future of Orevall Industries was in good hands with the next generation." I appreciated her words, though I noticed she'd phrased them carefully to avoid making specific commitments about my role in the company's future leadership. It wasn't until the following evening, after all the guests had left and we'd returned to the quiet of the family estate, that Dahlia's demeanor began to change. The vulnerability and shared grief that had characterized our interactions over the previous 3 days gave way to something more calculated and distant. She'd changed out of her funeral attire into a business suit, had spread financial documents across the dining room table, and was reviewing what appeared to be corporate governance materials when I found her. "I know this seems premature," she said without looking up from her papers, "but there are decisions that need to be made quickly to ensure business continuity. The board is meeting tomorrow morning to discuss interim leadership arrangements." Something in her tone made me pause. "What kind of arrangements?" "Well, obviously the company needs a CEO," she replied, still focused on her documents. "The board has asked me to consider stepping into that role, temporarily, while we evaluate long-term succession options." The word temporarily felt significant, though I couldn't quite articulate why. And what about my role in that process? For the first time since I'd entered the room, Dahlia looked directly at me. Her expression was sympathetic but firm, the same look she might give an employee who was about to receive disappointing news about a promotion request. "Lucian, sweetheart, I think it might be best if you took some time away from the company while we navigate this transition. You've been through a tremendous loss, and grief can cloud judgment when it comes to business decisions." The suggestion felt like a physical blow, but I kept my voice steady. "You're asking me to step away from Orevall Industries." "I'm suggesting that you take time to process your father's death and consider what you want to do with your future," she said gently. "You're young, talented, capable of building your own career rather than always working in Edmund's shadow." There it was. The first clear indication that the woman I'd considered a mother figure for 15 years was viewing me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a family member to be supported. The conversation that followed confirmed what I was beginning to suspect, that Dahlia's grief had been genuine, but her plans for the company's future had been developing long before Dad's heart attack. As she outlined her vision for interim leadership, board governance, and operational restructuring, I realized that I was listening to someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months, possibly years. Her suggestions weren't spontaneous responses to an unexpected tragedy. They were elements of a comprehensive strategy that she'd been developing while I'd been focused on operational details. The quiet stepson who'd never demanded recognition, never fought for position, never challenged authority, was about to discover that his stepmother had been planning his removal from the family business long before his father's death had made it possible. But as I sat there listening to Dahlia explain why my departure would be best for everyone, I remembered something my father had said during our last conversation about responsibility and legacy. I remembered his emphasis on my understanding of the company's culture and operations. I remembered the weight in his voice when he talked about the future. Edmund Orevall had spent 40 years building Orevall Industries, and he wasn't the kind of man who'd leave its future to chance. If Dahlia thought she could simply erase me from the equation, she was about to discover that my father had been planning for contingencies she didn't know about. The war for control of Orevall Industries was about to begin, and I was just starting to realize that I might not be as powerless in that fight as my stepmother assumed. The board meeting the next morning was held in the conference room adjacent to Dad's office, a space that still carried the faint scent of his preferred coffee blend and the lingering presence of decisions made over 4 decades of leadership. I wasn't invited to attend, but I could see through the glass walls as Dahlia presented her case for interim leadership to the 5-member board. Margaret Chen, our retired judge, nodded thoughtfully as Dahlia spoke. The 2 logistics experts, Robert Walsh and Sandra Torres, took notes and asked periodic questions. Our outside financial advisor, James Morrison, reviewed documents that Dahlia had prepared in advance. The entire presentation looked professional, thorough, and completely rehearsed. I watched from my office as the meeting concluded with handshakes and what appeared to be unanimous agreement. Dahlia emerged from the conference room 45 minutes later with the composed expression of someone who just achieved an important objective. She found me at my desk reviewing driver schedules, though I'd barely processed any of the information on my computer screen. "The board has asked me to serve as interim CEO," she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. "It's what Edmund would have wanted, continuity of leadership during a difficult transition period." I nodded, unsurprised by the outcome but struck by her phrasing. "How long is interim expected to last?" "That depends on several factors," she replied carefully. "Market conditions, operational performance, the board's assessment of long-term strategic needs. Probably 6 to 12 months while we evaluate all options." "And my role during this interim period?" Her pause lasted just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. "Lucian, I've been thinking about our conversation last night. Taking time away from the company really might be the healthiest thing for you right now. Grief affects decision-making in ways we don't always recognize." "You're firing me." "I'm suggesting a leave of absence," she corrected gently. "You could travel, pursue additional education, explore opportunities outside the logistics industry. With the severance package we're prepared to offer, you'd have complete financial freedom to discover what you're passionate about." I leaned back in my chair, studying the woman I'd known for 15 years. She was handling this conversation with the same smooth professionalism she'd displayed during the board presentation, but there was something else beneath the surface, a kind of relief, as if she were finally able to stop pretending about her intentions. "What if I'm passionate about Orevall Industries?" I asked quietly. "What if I want to continue the work I've been doing here for 8 years? Her smile became more strained. "That would make things complicated. The board has concerns about having family members in operational roles during a leadership transition. It creates potential conflicts of interest, especially when there are questions about succession planning." "What questions about succession planning?" "Well, your father never formalized any specific arrangements for transferring leadership responsibilities. The board feels it's important to evaluate all candidates objectively, rather than making assumptions based on family relationships." Something about her phrasing bothered me, but I couldn't immediately identify what felt wrong. Dad had been meticulous about business planning his entire career. The idea that he'd failed to make provisions for succession seemed inconsistent with everything I knew about his approach to management. "I'd like to see the formal documentation of the board's decision," I said. Dahlia's expression flickered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "Of course. I'll have copies prepared for you this afternoon. And I'd like to review Dad's succession planning documents, his will, any formal arrangements he made for leadership transition." Now her smile became more forced. "That's confidential information, Lucian. attorney-client privilege, family trust provisions. There are legal complexities that require careful handling. I'm family, I pointed out, and I'm also a senior employee with 8 years of service to this company. Which is exactly why this conversation is so difficult, she replied, standing up from her chair. Your dual role creates complications that the board wants to avoid during an already challenging transition period. She moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something important. I'll need your access cards and company laptop by the end of the week. Security protocols, you understand. After she left, I sat alone in my office trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 5 days, I'd gone from being a respected operations coordinator with 8 years of company experience to an unemployed family member being offered severance pay to disappear quietly. But the more I thought about Dahlia's explanations, the more questions I had. The board meeting had been scheduled remarkably quickly for a group of people with busy professional schedules. The succession planning documentation seemed suspiciously unavailable, and Dahlia's emphasis on interim leadership felt inconsistent with someone who was supposedly making temporary arrangements. I decided to start asking questions, beginning with Thomas Grimley. I found him in the dispatch center, coordinating route changes for a driver who'd called in sick. Thomas had been with the company for 12 years, long enough to understand both the formal and informal power structures that governed daily operations. "Can I buy you lunch?" I asked. "I need to discuss some things away from the office." We met at Murphy's Diner, a place frequented by truck drivers and warehouse workers, but unlikely to be visited by corporate executives. Over coffee and sandwiches, I shared the basics of my conversation with Dahlia, leaving out the emotional details, but focusing on the business implications. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as I described the board's concerns about family members in operational roles. "That doesn't sound right," he said finally. "Your father talked about succession planning constantly over the past 2 years. He was always asking questions about employee loyalty, operational continuity, long-term strategic vision." What kind of questions? Who would the drivers trust if something happened to him? Which managers understood the company culture well enough to maintain it during a transition? Whether the operational expertise existed internally to maintain our competitive advantages? Thomas paused, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. He was particularly interested in your relationships with the workforce, how the warehouse crews responded to your management style, whether you understood the customer relationships well enough to maintain them. This was news to me. Dad had never discussed succession planning directly, had never asked my opinions about leadership transition or management continuity. "Did he ever mention specific arrangements he was making?" I asked. "Not specifics, but he did say something interesting about 3 months ago. We were reviewing quarterly performance reports when he mentioned that he'd been working with attorneys on protecting the company's future. He didn't elaborate, but he seemed satisfied with whatever arrangements he was making." I felt a spark of hope mixed with frustration. If Dad had been making legal arrangements for succession planning, why hadn't he discussed them with me? And why was Dahlia claiming that no such arrangements existed? "Thomas, I need to ask you something confidential. Have you heard anything about a board meeting yesterday? Any discussion among the senior management team about interim leadership arrangements?" He shook his head slowly. "Yesterday was the first I'd heard about any board meeting. And honestly, I'm surprised they didn't include you in discussions about company leadership. You know the operational side better than anyone else, including Dahlia." That evening, I drove to the Thornwick Cemetery where Dad was buried, not because I expected to find answers among the headstones, but because I needed a quiet place to think. Standing beside his grave, I tried to imagine what he would have wanted for Orevall Industries, what arrangements he might have made to protect the company's future. Dad had been many things, but careless wasn't one of them. He'd spent 4 decades building something significant, employing thousands of people, serving customers across 12 states. The idea that he'd left the company's future entirely to chance felt completely inconsistent with his character, which meant either Dahlia was lying about the succession planning documentation, or Dad had made arrangements that she didn't know about. I decided to find out which possibility was correct. The next morning, I called Reynolds & Associates, the law firm that had handled Dad's business legal matters for over 20 years. Patricia Reynolds herself had drafted most of Orevall Industries, major contracts, and had advised Dad on everything from corporate governance to regulatory compliance. "I'm very sorry for your loss," Patricia said when I reached her by phone. "Your father was a remarkable man and a valued client. How can I help you?" "I'm trying to understand the succession planning arrangements he made for Orevall Industries. My stepmother mentioned that there weren't any formal documents, but that seems inconsistent with Dad's usual approach to business planning. There was a long pause before Patricia responded. Lucian, I'm bound by attorney-client privilege, but I can tell you that your father was very thorough about succession planning. He spent considerable time over the past 2 years ensuring that his intentions for the company's future were properly documented. Can you tell me what those documents contain? Not without proper authorization. But I will say this, if someone is claiming that no succession planning documentation exists, they're either misinformed or they haven't been given access to all relevant materials. My heart started beating faster. What kind of authorization would I need to review those documents? That depends on their specific nature and the provisions Edmund made for disclosure. Some materials might be accessible to family members, others might require probate court authorization, and some might have specific triggers for release. What kind of triggers? Patricia hesitated again. I think you should come in for a meeting, Lucian. There are some things we need to discuss in person, and I suspect you're going to want to review certain documents sooner rather than later. I scheduled an appointment for the following afternoon, feeling hopeful for the first time since Dad's death. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that Dahlia's confidence in her position might be premature. If Dad had made succession planning arrangements that she didn't know about, her assumption of company leadership could be challenged. The question was whether I was prepared for the fight that discovery would trigger. Because if Dahlia had been lying about the succession planning documentation, she'd been preparing for this transition much longer than I'd realized. And she wasn't going to give up control of a $200 million company without a battle. But I was beginning to understand that my father had been preparing for this possibility as well. And if Patricia Reynolds was right about the documentation he'd created, Dahlia might have significantly underestimated the quiet stepson she was trying to remove from the equation. The war for control of Orevall Industries was about to begin in earnest. Patricia Reynolds' law office occupied the top floor of a historic building in downtown Millbrook Heights, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the business district where Dad had built his empire. I arrived 15 minutes early for our appointment, using the extra time to gather my thoughts and prepare for what might be the most important conversation of my life. Patricia greeted me personally in the reception area, a gesture that immediately told me this meeting was more significant than routine legal consultation. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that came from 4 decades of handling complex business matters for successful entrepreneurs. Lucian, I'm glad you called, she said, leading me toward her private office. Your father and I had many conversations about this day, though we all hoped it wouldn't come so soon. Her office was elegant but functional, with leather-bound legal volumes lining the walls and a mahogany desk that had clearly seen decades of important decisions. She gestured for me to sit in one of the client chairs while she settled behind her desk with a thick file folder bearing the Orevall Industries logo. Before we begin, she said, opening the folder with deliberate care, I want you to understand that everything your father did was motivated by his love for you and his commitment to protecting the company he spent his life building. Some of what I'm about to show you may be difficult to process, but please remember that Edmund was thinking several moves ahead. My heart was already racing, but I nodded for her to continue. Your father came to see me 18 months ago with concerns about the company's future leadership, she began, removing a document from the folder. He'd been observing certain changes in company culture and management approach that worried him. He was particularly concerned about initiatives that prioritized short-term profitability over the employee welfare and community relationships that had always been central to Orevall Industries' identity. She slid a legal document across the desk toward me. The letterhead read Confidential Succession Planning Analysis and was dated 14 months earlier. Edmund asked me to conduct a thorough review of the company's ownership structure, board governance arrangements, and succession planning options. What we discovered prompted him to make some very specific legal arrangements. I scanned the document, trying to process the technical language and legal terminology. But one section made my breath catch. Current ownership analysis reveals potential vulnerabilities in family control structure that could enable hostile takeover by non-family board members in conjunction with surviving spouse. He was worried about Dahlia taking over the company? I asked. Patricia's expression was carefully neutral. He was worried about anyone taking over the company who didn't understand its fundamental values and long-term mission, Your father built Orevall Industries to be more than just a profitable business. He wanted it to be a force for good in the community, a place where employees were treated fairly, where success was shared rather than hoarded. She removed another document from the folder, this one bearing more recent dates. 6 months ago, Edmund made significant changes to his estate planning and corporate ownership arrangements. Changes that Dahlia either doesn't know about or has chosen not to disclose. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for the document. It was titled Amended Corporate Ownership Transfer Agreement and was signed by my father just 4 months before his death. The key provision was outlined in bold text near the top of the first page. Upon the death of Edmund Orevall, controlling interest in Orevall Industries, 70% of voting shares shall transfer immediately to Lucian Orevall, with provisions for operational continuity and board governance transition. I read the sentence 3 times before the full implications began to sink in. 70%? I own 70% of Orevall Industries? You do, Patricia confirmed. Your father restructured the ownership specifically to ensure that control of the company would remain with someone who understood its operational culture and shared his vision for its future. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in everything I thought I knew about my position in the family and the company. But Dahlia said there were no succession planning documents. She told me Dad never formalized any arrangements for leadership transition. Patricia's expression hardened slightly. Dahlia received a copy of the amended ownership agreement 2 weeks after your father's death, along with detailed instructions about the transition process. If she told you no such arrangements existed, she was deliberately misleading you. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Dahlia lied about the succession planning, but she'd done so while knowing exactly what my father had intended for the company's future. She'd been planning to remove me from Orevall Industries while concealing the fact that I was actually the majority owner. There's more, Patricia continued, removing additional documents from the folder. Your father also prepared detailed instructions for corporate governance during the transition period. He appointed you as chairman of the board with authority to hire and fire senior executives, including the CEO position. She handed me another document, this one titled Transition Authority Memorandum. The language was clear and unambiguous. Lucian Orevall would assume immediate control of all strategic decisions, with full authority to restructure management as needed to ensure operational continuity. Why didn't he tell me about any of this? I asked, struggling to understand why Dad would make such significant arrangements without discussing them with me directly. He planned to, Patricia replied gently. These documents were meant to be accompanied by a comprehensive transition conversation, where he would explain his reasoning and prepare you for the leadership responsibilities. Unfortunately, his death came sooner than any of us expected. She reached into the folder one more time, removing an envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. He did leave this for you, though. Instructions to be delivered only if the transition became contested or if questions arose about his intentions. I opened the envelope with hands that were no longer steady. Inside was a 2-page letter in Dad's precise script. Son, if you're reading this, it means Patricia has had to reveal the arrangements I made without having the chance to explain them to you personally. I'm sorry for that. I'd hoped we would have years to discuss the company's future and your role in leading it. I chose you to inherit controlling interest in Orevall Industries, not because you're my son, but because you're the person best qualified to protect what we've built together. You understand the operational heart of this business. You've earned the respect of our employees through years of shared work. You share my commitment to treating people fairly and building something that serves the broader community. I've been watching Dahlia's influence on company culture over the past 2 years, and I'm concerned about the direction she wants to take us. Her suggestions consistently prioritize profit maximization over employee welfare and community relationships. That's not necessarily wrong from a business perspective, but it's not consistent with the values that make Orevall Industries special. I restructured the ownership to ensure that those values survive my death. You may not feel ready for this responsibility, but I've watched you grow into someone who can handle it. Trust your instincts, protect our people, and don't let anyone convince you that being decent in business is a weakness. The company is yours now. Use it wisely. Dad. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the letter and the magnitude of what I'd just discovered, Everything had changed in the span of an hour. I wasn't the powerless stepson being forced out of the family business. I was the majority owner who'd been lied to and manipulated by someone I'd trusted for 15 years. "Patricia," I said finally, "how quickly can I exercise the authority outlined in these documents?" "Immediately," she replied. "The ownership transfer became effective upon your father's death. You've been the controlling shareholder of Orevall Industries for the past week. You just didn't know it. And Dahlia's appointment as interim CEO has no legal validity without your approval as chairman of the board. In fact, according to the governance provisions your father established, any major personnel decisions require your explicit authorization." The full scope of Dahlia's deception was becoming clear. She'd convinced the board to appoint her as interim CEO while concealing the fact that such an appointment required approval from the actual controlling shareholder. She'd offered me severance pay to leave a company that I legally owned. She'd manipulated the entire situation while knowing that my father had specifically arranged for me to inherit control. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, reaching for a final document. "Your father anticipated that the transition might be contested, so he prepared detailed documentation of the reasoning behind his decisions. Financial analysis, operational assessments, employee feedback surveys, everything needed to demonstrate that his choice was based on business merit rather than family sentiment." She handed me a bound report titled Succession Planning Justification Analysis. Even a quick scan revealed comprehensive data supporting Dad's conclusion that I was the most qualified candidate to lead Orevall Industries into the future. "He really was thinking several moves ahead," I said, amazed by the thoroughness of his preparation. "Edmund never made important decisions impulsively," Patricia agreed. "He spent months analyzing this situation from every possible angle before restructuring the ownership. These arrangements weren't motivated by emotion. They were motivated by his assessment of what would best serve the company's long-term interests." I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb the full implications of what I'd learned. Dahlia hadn't just betrayed my trust. She'd attempted to steal control of a company that legally belonged to me. She'd lied to the board, misrepresented the succession planning arrangements, and tried to force me out of my own business. But now I had the documentation to prove Dad's actual intentions. I had legal authority to restructure the company's leadership. Most importantly, I had evidence that Dahlia had been deliberately deceptive about the most fundamental aspects of the ownership transition. "What do you recommend as next steps?" I asked. Patricia smiled for the first time since our meeting began. "I recommend that you exercise your rights as chairman of the board. Call an emergency board meeting, present the ownership documentation, and clarify the actual succession arrangements your father made. And Dahlia's position as interim CEO? That's entirely up to you. As majority owner, you have the authority to terminate her appointment immediately or allow her to continue in a subordinate role if you believe that serves the company's interests." I thought about the employees who'd trusted me over the years, the drivers who'd asked me to serve as a pallbearer at Dad's funeral, the warehouse crews who'd worked overtime to ensure customer satisfaction. I thought about Thomas Grimley's concerns about changing company culture and the fears he'd mentioned about job security. Most of all, I thought about Dad's letter and his emphasis on protecting the values that made Orevall Industries special. "I think it's time for me to start acting like the owner of this company," I said, standing up from my chair with more confidence than I'd felt since Dad's death. Patricia stood as well, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "Your father would be proud of you, Lucian. He always believed you had the strength to handle this responsibility when the time came." As I left her office with copies of all the succession planning documents, I realized that the quiet stepson who'd been dismissed as a powerless burden was about to reveal himself as the actual controlling shareholder of Orevall Industries. Dahlia's carefully orchestrated takeover was about to encounter an obstacle she'd never anticipated: the truth about what my father had actually planned for the company's future. The war for control of Orevall Industries was about to shift dramatically in my favor, and I finally understood that I had the weapons to win it. I didn't call ahead. I didn't schedule a meeting. At 8:30 the next morning, I walked directly into the Orevall Industries headquarters, carrying a leather briefcase containing copies of every document Patricia Reynolds had shown me. The security guard at the front desk, Marcus Henley, looked surprised to see me. "Morning, Lucian," he said carefully. "I thought you were taking some time off." "Change of plans, Marcus. I need you to call an emergency board meeting for 10 o'clock this morning, all 5 members, no exceptions." His eyebrows shot up. "I'm not sure I have the authority to." "You don't," I interrupted, but not unkindly. "I do. As chairman of the board and majority shareholder of Orevall Industries, I'm calling this meeting. Please contact Margaret Chen, Robert Walsh, Sandra Torres, and James Morrison immediately." Marcus stared at me for a moment, clearly confused by my sudden shift in demeanor, but something in my tone convinced him to pick up the phone. As he began making calls, I headed for the executive elevator. Dahlia was in Dad's office, my office now, reviewing what appeared to be financial restructuring proposals when I walked in without knocking. She looked up with the practiced smile she'd perfected over 15 years, but I could see uncertainty flickering behind her eyes. "Lucian, sweetheart, what are you doing here? I thought we agreed you'd take some time to process everything." "We need to talk," I said, settling into the chair across from Dad's desk. "About succession planning, about the board meeting yesterday, and about the documents you forgot to mention." Her smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." I opened my briefcase and removed the amended ownership agreement, placing it on the desk between us. This document, dated 4 months ago, transferring 70% controlling interest in Orevall Industries to me upon Dad's death. The color drained from Dahlia's face, but she recovered quickly. "Where did you get that?" "From Patricia Reynolds, Dad's attorney." "The same attorney who sent you a copy 2 weeks ago, along with detailed transition instructions." I leaned forward slightly. "The same documents you claimed didn't exist when you convinced me to leave the company." Dahlia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming silently on the desk surface. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "Your father made a mistake," she said coldly. "He was sentimental about family relationships instead of focusing on what's best for the business. You're not ready to run a company this size." "That's not your decision to make anymore," I replied. "It wasn't your decision to make yesterday, and it won't be your decision tomorrow. You lied to the board about the succession arrangements, and you lied to me about my father's intentions." She stood up abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the warehouse complex below. "Do you have any idea how much damage this will cause? The board has already announced my appointment as interim CEO. Investors are expecting continuity of leadership. Changing course now will create instability that could cost us millions in revenue. The only instability here is the illegal assumption of authority by someone who doesn't actually have it," I said. "At 10 o'clock this morning, I'm presenting the real succession planning documents to the board. Your interim appointment will be terminated, and we'll discuss the company's actual future." Dahlia turned from the window, her expression harder than I'd ever seen it. "You're making a serious mistake, Lucian. Running a business requires more than operational knowledge and employee loyalty. It requires strategic vision, financial acumen, the ability to make difficult decisions that prioritize long-term success over short-term sentiment. Like the decision to lie to your stepson about his inheritance. Like the decision to protect a company from being destroyed by someone who isn't qualified to lead it," she snapped. "Your father built something significant here, but he let emotion cloud his judgment when it came to succession planning. I won't stand by and watch you destroy his legacy through inexperience and misplaced idealism." I stood up as well, gathering the documents from the desk. "This conversation is over. You have 2 choices. Attend the board meeting and acknowledge the actual ownership structure, or pack your office and leave the building. Either way, your unauthorized control of this company ends today." As I headed for the door, Dahlia's voice stopped me. "The employees won't follow you. The board won't respect you. The investors will pull their funding the moment they realize a 28-year-old with no executive experience is trying to run a $200 million company." I turned back to face her one last time. "We'll find out, won't we?" The emergency board meeting convened in the main conference room at exactly 10 o'clock. All 5 members were present, though their expressions ranged from curious to concerned to visibly annoyed at being summoned on such short notice. Margaret Chen, the retired federal judge who served as our lead independent director, called the meeting to order. "Lucian, you've requested this emergency session. Please explain the urgency." I stood at the head of the conference table, the same position where I'd watched Dahlia present her case for interim leadership just days earlier. But this time, I was the one with documentation, authority, and truth on my side. "Thank you all for coming," I began, opening my briefcase and distributing copies of the ownership transfer agreement to each board member. I called this meeting to clarify significant misrepresentations about our company's succession planning arrangements. The room fell silent as the board members reviewed the documents. Robert Walsh, our logistics expert, was the first to speak. "This shows you as the majority shareholder," he said, looking confused. "But yesterday, Dahlia told us no formal succession arrangements had been made." "Dahlia received copies of these documents 2 weeks ago," I replied, handing out additional materials, along with detailed transition instructions and governance provisions that make clear my father's intentions for company leadership. Margaret Chen studied the papers carefully, her legal training evident in the thoroughness of her review. "These documents appear to be properly executed and legally binding. Lucian, you're saying you've been the controlling shareholder since your father's death." "That's correct. And according to the governance provisions Dad established, any major personnel decisions, including CEO appointments, require my explicit approval as chairman of the board." James Morrison, our financial advisor, looked directly at Dahlia. "You were aware of these arrangements when you requested board approval for your interim appointment." Dahlia's composure finally cracked. Edmund made those arrangements without consulting anyone about their business implications. He was thinking like a father, not like a CEO. "He was thinking like the founder and owner of this company," I said firmly. "And he made provisions to ensure that Orevall Industries would continue to operate according to the values and principles he'd established over 40 years. Sandra Torres raised her hand slightly. "What are you proposing as next steps?" I took a deep breath, thinking about Dad's letter and his emphasis on protecting the company's culture and values. "I'm proposing that we honor my father's actual succession plan instead of the unauthorized arrangement that was implemented through deception." The vote was unanimous. Dahlia's interim appointment was terminated immediately, and I was confirmed as chairman and CEO of Orevall Industries, with full authority to restructure company leadership as needed. As the board members filed out of the conference room, Dahlia remained seated, staring at the documents scattered across the table. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "it is." 7 months later, I'm sitting in the same office where Dahlia tried to convince me I had no future at Orevall Industries. The morning sun streams through windows that overlook our expanded warehouse complex, where 127 new employees have joined our team since I took over as CEO. The quarterly reports spread across my desk tell a story of growth, stability, and renewed employee confidence that even I hadn't expected so quickly. The transition wasn't seamless. The first few weeks after the board meeting were chaotic, filled with damage control, employee meetings, and difficult conversations with investors who'd been caught off guard by the leadership change. Some vendors questioned whether a 28-year-old could maintain the business relationships his father had built over decades. A few long-term contracts required renegotiation when clients expressed concerns about operational continuity. But the employees rallied in ways that surprised everyone, including me. Thomas Grimley became my unofficial right hand during the transition, helping bridge the gap between my operational knowledge and the executive responsibilities I was still learning. The warehouse crews worked overtime to ensure that customer service never suffered during the leadership disruption. Veteran drivers reached out to clients personally, vouching for my character and commitment to maintaining the company standards they'd come to expect. Most importantly, the culture of fear and uncertainty that had been building under Dahlia's influence began to evaporate. Employees stopped worrying about job security and started focusing on innovation and growth. The suggestions program Dad had established years earlier, which had been quietly discontinued during Dahlia's interim period, was restored and immediately generated ideas that improved efficiency and reduced costs. Dahlia left the company the day after the board meeting, but not quietly. She retained an employment attorney and threatened legal action, claiming she'd been promised long-term security in her role and deserved compensation for the business relationships she'd developed. The threats evaporated when her attorney reviewed the succession planning documents and realized she had no legal standing to challenge my father's arrangements. She also attempted to convince several key employees to leave with her, offering them positions at companies owned by her business associates. Only one person accepted, our former head of finance, who'd been instrumental in implementing the cost-cutting measures that had worried Thomas and the operations team. His departure actually improved morale among the remaining staff. The most revealing moment came 3 weeks after her departure, when Margaret Chen approached me after a board meeting with information that put Dahlia's actions in stark perspective. "I did some research," Margaret said, handing me a folder containing corporate filings and business registration documents. Dahlia established a consulting company 6 months before your father's death. She'd already signed contracts with 2 logistics firms, positioning herself as an expert in operational efficiency and corporate restructuring. The document showed that Dahlia had been planning her exit strategy long before Dad's heart attack, setting up a business that would capitalize on her experience at Orevall Industries. She hadn't just been positioning herself to take over the company. She'd been preparing to leave with enough knowledge and connections to compete against us. She was never planning to stay, I realized. She wanted to strip away our best practices, our client relationships, our operational innovations, and package them for our competitors. Margaret nodded grimly. Your father's succession planning wasn't just about keeping the company in family hands. It was about protecting the business from someone who saw it as a stepping stone rather than a legacy to preserve. That revelation helped me understand why Dad had been so meticulous about the ownership transfer. He hadn't just been thinking about family dynamics. He'd been protecting Orevall Industries from corporate espionage disguised as marriage. The changes I implemented over the following months were guided by the letter Dad had left for me, particularly his emphasis on protecting company values while adapting to business realities. We restored the generous benefits package that had been under review for cost optimization. We increased our investment in driver training and safety programs. We expanded our community outreach initiatives and strengthened our relationships with local suppliers. But the most meaningful change had been in how I viewed myself. For 8 years, I defined my worth by how well I could prove myself to people who seemed determined not to see my value. Now I understood that worth isn't something you prove to others. It's something you demonstrate through your choices when no one is watching. The evening before the Foundation's first annual fundraising dinner, I found myself back in Rowick's study, reading through his personal papers and trying to understand the man who had shaped my life so profoundly through his elaborate test. In a leather journal tucked behind his business files, I found an entry dated just 3 months before his death. Watched Darian help an elderly woman with her groceries in the hospital parking lot today while waiting for Muriel's appointment. He had no idea I could see him from the window. Same instinct that made him stop for Celia 8 years ago. Character isn't performance, it's reflex. He's ready for what's coming. I closed the journal and looked around the study that had become my workspace. The books and awards that had once intimidated me now felt like tools I was privileged to inherit. The responsibility that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like an opportunity to build something meaningful. The next evening, as I stood before 300 guests at the Foundation's inaugural dinner, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The factory worker who had pulled a stranger from a burning car had become a business leader capable of directing millions toward causes that mattered. The man who had endured years of humiliation had learned to use power with wisdom rather than vindictiveness. 8 years ago, I told the gathered crowd, a car accident changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. Tonight, we're launching an initiative that will help other people survive their own life-changing moments and rebuild stronger than before. As applause filled the ballroom, I caught sight of Celia at our table, her face glowing with pride and love. Beside her sat Muriel and Theodore. No longer the family that had tested me, but the family that had chosen me. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving your worth to people who doubted you. Sometimes it's discovering that your worth was never in question. You just needed the right circumstances to see it clearly. The man who had risked everything to save a stranger had learned that kindness is always the right choice, even when it takes 8 years for the reward to become apparent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. And if someone tries to convince you that you don't deserve what you've earned, check the documents. Sometimes the truth is written down in places they hope you'll never look. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.